many attachments that can be attached to pistols of all types.
All right, so we talked about and introduced some side-by-side photographs concerning that you took during your analysis concerning the casings. I want to show you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 35C from page 27 of 63 of your bench notes. You recognize those photographs as being side-by-side photographs of two projectiles, which are now in evidence as states 35B from the scene and 163C from the van.
Yes.
You want to move states exhibit 35C into evidence.
Ms. Scott, have you had an opportunity to look at it?
Yes, I have.
Any objections other than previously discussed?
None other than those previously discussed.
All right, it'll be admitted at this time.
Yeah, publish.
You may publish.
35C. Well, let's just start with the bottom here, I guess. And again, did you take photographs of every area of association concerning the marks found on the projectiles of these two different exhibits?
No.
Is this just a demonstrative photograph of one such area?
Yes.
And is it better for your explanation to focus on the top photograph or the bottom?
I would suggest probably the bottom one.
Okay, so let me see if I can. Okay, so is that too out of focus? Is that focus enough, or is that distorted?
It's a little out of
Do you
focus.
have the autofocus button? Miss Gowdy knows where it's at.
It's on.
AF, autofocus.
That's it.
That's right. Okay, well, let me see if it focuses again. And how does it appear on your monitor, ma'am?
A little better.
Okay, let me go a little bit further out. Still have to hit the autofocus? Well, let me do this. May the witness step down.
Yes.
I'm going to hand you 35C. And if you can just describe for the jury, please, the portion in the box. It demonstrates what area of association?
So again, this is each of these is a picture of two different bullets that I used for comparison, and these are actually different areas on the same bullet, same group, groups of bullets, and it's really kind of difficult to see from the picture. Again, the pictures are more from my recollection, but you can see a couple lines that basically go across from one bullet to the other. And that's the pattern of striations that I'm looking at. So this is one area, this is one land impression in the bullet. So like I said, there's rifling that goes through the bullet. So there's a set number of those, of basically grooves that look through the bullet. And so this is one of them, this is another one, and there's actually pictures of other ones. But you can kind of see where the lines that go all the way across, those are the repeating patterns that are from both bullets that I look at.
Okay, thank you. Please take your seat. So let me talk to you about the terminology used within the field of firearms identification. You have indicated that your opinion is, for instance, that the casings collected from the crime scene were fired from the same gun as the casings collected from the Victoria's Secret bag and from the Keetley pasture. Is that to be termed an identification?
Yes.
All right. And what is meant by that term identification as you use it within the field of firearms identification?
So an identification basically means that they were fired from or in the same firearm. It means all those class characteristics are corresponding, that they're the same, and there's a good pattern of those individual characteristics that are repeating from component to component.
And to what certainty do you express that opinion?
It's a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
May I have a moment? No.
Yes.
Thank you. I would tender the witness.
Cross-examination?
Okay, folks, buckle up. Leanne Gowdy is about to start one of the most important cross-examinations of her career. Let's not forget that Michael Keetley's case is the oldest in the county. He's been sitting in jail for almost 10 years. Here we go.
Of any other gun in the world, correct?
Because I cannot examine every other firearm in the world, I can't say to the exclusion of all firearms, but I have never found two firearms to leave the same markings.
And let's talk a little bit about that. The standard that you use to say, okay, I've identified these markings under this microscope on this bullet, spent bullet, in comparison to this other spent bullet, when you decide, okay, this is sufficient for me, what's that standard?
Are you referring to the theory of identification?
I'm referring to the standard that's in your protocol and procedures that you use to decide that you can say these two items were fired from the same firearm.
That would be sufficient agreement.
Sufficient agreement. And so what sufficient agreement means is that when you, as the examiner, are looking at these items under this comparison microscope, you reflect back through the catalog of your brain and decide when you've seen another group of markings that was as good as what you're seeing. Isn't that what you do to get to sufficient agreement?
So it means during my training and also throughout my experience, I've looked at hundreds of known cartridge cases and bullets that I know were fired from the same firearm, and I can see what correspondence of patterns of individual characteristics are there. And I also look at firearm or components that I know were fired from different firearms, so I can still see what kind of correspondence may be there that's accidental. And so when I make an identification, the pattern I'm looking at has to greatly exceed the patterns that I've seen accidentally that are from components fired from different firearms, and it's similar to what the correspondence I've seen in some components that are fired in the same firearm.
Okay. All right. Do you have that standard, do you have your standard operating procedures with you today?
No, I do not.
You take a look at what I'm showing you. I'll mark it as Defense Exhibit 15. Are those your standard operating procedures at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in 2010?
Yes.
And within those standard operating procedures, do they have a definition of what sufficient agreement is?
Okay, we have to step out of court for a commercial break. We'll get you back into more testimony. This is Florida versus Michael Keetley. The firearms expert is on cross-examination. Let's go back in live.
Consistent the end product will be, correct?
Yes.
And so let's go back and talk a little bit about the shell casings. You said that the shell casings that were found, do you have them in front of you?
I believe these are the bullets.
I'm going to hand this binder to you that has several of the shell casings. Pull out any one of the envelopes that contains one of the shell casings you examined here. And which one did you pull that out of?
This is from State's Exhibit 7A.
So what we're looking here is at a shell casing, correct?
A cartridge case, yes.
A cartridge casing, correct? And that's what ends up getting ejected out of a firearm, correct?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Are there .45 caliber revolvers that are manufactured?
Not 45 auto, but there are ways they can be loaded into a 45 revolver.
Into a .45 revolver?
I believe it's 45 Colt. It's a different caliber.
Okay. And there are .45 caliber long guns, correct?
Yes, a few.
Okay. What there isn't is a .45 caliber pump action shotgun, correct?
No, a shotgun is a different type of firearm.
Okay. And when we look at this shell casing, what all of us can see is what we're seeing here under this Elmo, correct?
Yes.
All right. And so you have to take this a step further and put it under that microscope so that you can use your own catalog of images from past examinations to decide whether there's, quote, sufficient agreement, end quote, correct?
Yes.
And Winchester is a common manufacturer of ammunition, correct?
Correct.
Now, when we talk about, see how we see this thing in the center with the little, like, indentation?
Yes.
Okay, what is that?
That is where the firing pin struck the cartridge case.
And when you look at that, that's when you determine that what you're seeing in your examination is consistent with a Glock 45 caliber firearm, correct?
Yes, but the combination of all the class characteristics.
Okay. Class characteristics are
So the firing pin shape and the shape of the aperture shear in this instance.
that would be dictated basically by the manufacturer, correct? All right, and so class characteristics on it indicate to you this could possibly been fired from a Glock, correct?
Correct.
But it could have also been fired from a Smith & Wesson Sigma series, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And that is also a handgun,
Yes.
correct? And then when we switch over to the projectiles or the spent bullets, those could not have been fired from a Glock, correct?
Not a manufactured Glock barrel, no.
Okay. And could those have been fired from a Smith & Wesson Sigma series?
No, those are not on the list either.
Okay. So now you just looked at a list. So what happens is you get the bullet and you put in some of its measurements and its class characteristics into a system, correct?
Correct.
And when you do that, then a computer system spits out to you all kinds of possible firearms that could have produced that bullet, right?
Based on the class characteristics.
On the
yes.
class characteristics, correct?
Correct.
And when you did that, the computer spit out a whole lot of guns, right?
There were 27 results, but some of those were duplicated.
Okay, so let's assume 7 of them were duplicates. 20 different kinds of guns, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And could any of those 20 different kinds of guns also potentially produce that shell casing?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, is that a possibility?
Again, I don't see how it, I don't believe it is, but again, I can't examine every firearm.
And you're not aware of every type of firearm that's manufactured in the world, correct?
Correct.
And when you change a firing pin, you can change a firing pin in a handgun, correct?
You can, but it has to still be able to fit into the firearm.
Okay. And so let's talk a little bit. I think earlier you talked about, you can remove the barrel from a Glock, you push the slide back, and you press some sort of a spring, right?
Yes, you remove the slide and you pull a spring out.
Okay. How would you do that? Demonstrate to us with your hands how you would do that.
So if I'm holding the firearm, there's a little lever, it's a little spring-activated lever that you push down. What, is this for a Glock specifically, or?
A Glock or the Sigma series?
Well, I'm sorry, different pistols have completely different ways of taking them apart. So
Is Sigma easier or harder?
probably equivalent.
Okay, so let's do let's show the jury what you can do. How do you do it?
So basically, there's some kind of a lever or device or a button that will usually release the slide. So you push that in to take the slide off. It usually slides against its rails. And then you have 2 parts. The top is the slide and the bottom is the frame. And then in this case, if you take the slide or the spring out, it's usually under some kind of tension. So you just push that out and take it out.
Can you do that one-handed?
No, it would probably require 2 hands for me.
So when we're talking about what you look for, we talked about class characteristics, correct?
Yes.
And class characteristics are the characteristics that are basically specified by the manufacturer, correct?
Correct.
And then there's a thing called subclass characteristics, correct?
Correct.
And subclass characteristics, and correct me if I'm wrong, subclass characteristics are characteristics that are created during the manufacturing process by a tool, correct?
Yes, all the characteristics are created by a tool.
And so what happens...
Folks, I'm sorry to interrupt. We got to hit a break, but we'll get you back into this riveting cross-examination at the top of the hour. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Seema Iyer. We are in gavel-to-gavel coverage of Florida versus Michael Keetley. We will also bring you an update on the Weinstein case, but right now, let's go back into court in Keetley, cross-examination of the firearms expert. Here we go.
Okay, in fact, the National Research Council has criticized the subjectivity involved in firearm and tool mark examinations, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, in 2016, the President's Council on Science and Technology also criticized that, basically that underlying concept of firearms and tool mark examination, correct?
They reported that they did not have the abilities to research more into it.
Your Honor, if I could have a second.
My guests are still with me. Corey Stern, you said that you thought Leanne Gowdy is doing a great job so far. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, she's being surgical in her examination of the witness. It's very hard, no matter what type of case it is, to take testimony from an expert in a very technical field. And she's doing it in a way that is both conversational and also easy for the jury to understand. She is almost death by a thousand
Let's
cuts.
listen back in.
Yep.
Thanks, Corey.
Or acting like a pump action shotgun, correct?
I don't believe so, no.
I don't have any other questions.
Yes, thank you. So you've answered some questions on firearms manufacturers' pursuit of uniformity in the process of manufacture. As a firearms examiner, and based upon your training experience and visiting of the manufacturers that you have, would you expect that the highest degree of uniformity amongst firearms manufactured from one manufacturer would be within firearms consecutively manufactured in the same production?
Yes.
And have there been studies that you're aware of where consecutively manufactured firearms were tested, the casings expended or the cartridges shot for them, to determine whether analysts could discern or distinguish casings or projectiles fired from those consecutively manufactured firearms, to determine whether they could identify the first one, distinguish the casing fired from the first one as opposed to the second one, as opposed to the fourth one or the fifth one on these lines?
Yes.
And has such type of research been done to validate the ability of an analyst to draw such distinctions in terms of individual characteristics of even consecutively manufactured firearms?
Yes.
Objection as to the leading.
This is the answer. The other one is yes, so I'll overrule the objection.
Thank you. Nothing further.
And this witness be excused by the state
Yes.
and by the defense.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, then we'll sit down and be excused as a witness at this time.